Hey everyone, today we're going to study and think about Chicano youth in the educational system. You'll see here I have the word Chicanx as it's more modern, more now, so we're not going to go into that topic at this time. But historically, we think about Chicano or Mexican American students in the educational system. So you may hear me go between terms, but most of you are probably familiar with Chicano or Mexican American or quote Hispanic. For now, we'll leave it at that. Let's get started. Let's look here at this picture of preschoolers at a Head Start program in San Ysidro, California. In a minute, they're going to be very important to think about these larger educational systems that they enter. So here we have an image of Sal Castro students from the 1968 walkouts or blowouts, Mecha, and the Department of Chicano Studies. So these are a number of historical legacies of Chicanos, Mexican Americans fighting for equality within the educational system in the United States. 1968 walkouts, taking back the schools. This is very important to Chicano students because they really called for improving education, and this was a major concern during the Chicano movement. They were really questioning and fighting for the quality of education, fighting against racism that they experienced within the school setting. Student activism was definitely needed in order to improve their schooling conditions, their access to resources within schools, simple things like books or bathroom breaks, or being treated fairly. Students during this time faced harsh realities of systematic discrimination within the educational system and harsh racism from school officials. A lot of times students would be told that they weren't going to make it, that they were going to simply be janitors or these quote low-skilled workers. Students took the initiative to organize these walkouts to have better schooling conditions overall. Let's take a moment now and look at Chicano or Chicanx demographics in the United States. You may ask yourself, how are we studying historical issues of Chicanos in education, and how does that have an impact on today's time? Well, let's consider what this group looks like as a whole in the United States. Well, there are over 35 million Latinos in the US. Of that group called Latino, quote, Chicanos comprise 66% of that population. So that means they're the largest number of, quote, Chicanos within the Latino category. They're the fastest and the youngest, largest growing population out of the, quote, Latino or Latinx population. The median age is 24 years old, so we know that this is a young group. 1 out of every 2 Chicanos under the age of 18 lives in poverty. 56% do not graduate from high school, 7% graduate from college. So pay close attention to these last percentages. So what happens when Chicanos or Mexican students are not receiving fair treatment within the educational system? So what is the Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx Educational Pipeline? This pipeline represents a system of connecting educational institutions, schooling structures, practices, and discourses that facilitate the flow of knowledge, skills, and students along the educational pipeline. So this means, what does the educational system look like as a whole? So think about your experience with an education. What do you learn along that, quote, pipeline? What are you taught? What kind of values? What kind of textbooks are privileged? What kind of teachers do you have? So what is being facilitated, or what flows through that pipeline? Students themselves flow through that pipeline. So we're going to look here at a moment at the leaks of the pipeline. So here again we have the image of the preschool students at a Head Start program in San Ysidro, California, right next to the US-Mexican border. Let's think of these students. Some of us may be able to relate to these students. I know I can. So what does the pipeline look like? And what does it represent when we put real faces to these larger ideas? Let's imagine 100 little Mexican Chicanito, Chicanita students. So here we have a couple of them. Imagine that that whole image is filled up with 100 students. Okay, so let's go. What is their experience along that pipeline? So here we have the graph of the actual pipeline. So if you look at the very top of the graph with me, you'll see it says 100 elementary students. These are 100 Chicano or Mexican students. By the time they reach high school, 56 are dropped out. So consider that language, drop out versus push out, and we'll get to that here in a moment. 56 students do not graduate from high school. So I want you to consider what happens when they are, quote, dropping out or when they are pushed out. What happens there? Where do they go? What happens to their lives? What kind of quality do you think they may now live? So we have the number 44 here. 44% do graduate from high school, but of that 44%, only 26 enroll in college. 26 of those students that enroll in some higher education, 17 go to a community college and 9 go to a four-year college. So again, you're seeing the unevenness of who gets to go to a four-year college versus a community college. So think about those dynamics within that level of the pipeline. So let's think about what happened next. We do have some of you in community college, some of you go on to a four-year, but we're going to see that not many students are able to transfer to a four-year college from the community college level. So we lose a lot of students there. If you look back up from the number 17, we'll go up to see the 56. We lose a lot of students there right out of high school, students not transferring to a four-year. And if we take our attention back to the 9 go to a four-year college, we also lose students there. Okay, so if we look here at 7 graduate with a BA degree, so consider that. We started off with those 100 students, those little kids entering elementary school, okay? By the time they get to high school, we lose about half. And then by the time that we are able to enroll into a four-year community college, only 7 graduate with a bachelor's degree. And we know that there were more people enrolled, but something happened. These leaks were continuous along the pipeline. So let's look at the 7 that graduate. 2 will graduate with a professional or graduate degree, so they may go on to get a master's degree, okay? And then from those 2, we also lose students at that level of education. And then finally, you'll see we have less than 1 graduate with a doctoral degree, or what you may know as a PhD. So consider that. Go all the way back up, look there at that 100, and trickle your eyes all the way down. We have less than 1% that graduate with a doctorate degree. So at every level of the pipeline, you're able to see that for whatever reasons, we're losing students. And we know that students were enrolled, they had goals, they had ambitions, they had aspirations, but we're looking at the larger picture of these leaks due to historical racism, inequality within education, not having access to resources, money, these types of things that make people successful in the educational pipeline. In conclusion, let's think about what is a dropout and what is a push out. Usually when we think of a dropout, there are a lot of negative connotations to that. We only consider the fault of the student or, quote, the individual. And issues of structural racism and discrimination within the school system is invisible. There is no deconstruction or analysis about why so many students are forced to drop out. When we think about the dropout, most likely, if I would ask you to take a moment, what kind of things do you think about when you hear the term dropout? It may be negative, such as that student was lazy, that student didn't want it, that student wasn't smart enough, and we can go on and on and on. And a lot of times these stereotypes go hand in hand with the way that students of color and people in general are perceived to be lazy or stupid or lacking ambition. Now let's consider the push out. What does that mean? If we think about the pipeline, I've asked you to think about how are students forced off that pipeline. In so many ways, how are they pushed out? When we change that connotation of just a simple dropout, the individual, quote, student that didn't want it, the, quote, loser, the, quote, unacademic, right? And we think about the push out, we have to consider how unequal schooling instructions burden Chicano or students of color. And we recognize the unequal dynamics of power. So what within that educational pipeline did not support, let's say, students of color, bilingual students, students that were undocumented perhaps, students who had families that worked too much, students that didn't have access to books or computers or these types of resources. So many ways the school structure is designed to, quote, push out students. And I'll leave my last point there. There's an excellent book by Andrade, I believe his last name is, called The Art of Critical Pedagogy. And he goes into more details of how schools themselves are designed in this unequal fashion, and that students of color, low-income students, actually are doing what they're supposed to do and, quote, are dropping out. And I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. Thank you. Have a good one.